Peggy 16.
It happened an age ago.
Yeah, I'm hyped all over again. It's wild. Let's make sure we're watching this in the highest quality. I can't believe I never watched this. What is wrong with me?
I recall I see it true.
It's so clean.
On a night of wintry fog, the rune of death was stolen. And the demigods began to fall. Starting with Godwyn the Golden.
So he's not actually dead. I guess that makes sense because
Queen Marika was driven to the brink.
is he dead? Light or Malekith?
The shattering ensued, a war that wrought only darkness. The Elden Ring was broken.
I'm in.
But by whom? And why?
The capital.
What could the demigods ever hope to win by warring?
Oh, she's already lost her arm. I thought she lost it to Rodon.
The conqueror of the stars, General Radahn. And the blade of Mikkel and Melania the Seventh. These two were the mightiest to remain, and locked horns in combat.
What is she? Who is stabbing who? I'm confused. Is she stabbing him or is she being stabbed?
Victor.
Fucking bitch. Holy shit! Look at what she did!
And so, we inhabit a fractured world, awaiting the arrival of the Elden Lord. Unless, of course, thou shouldst take the crown.
Yeah. Yeah, like... Let's finish this. That's the end. Oh my god, that's freaking epic. I never saw this. Oh my god. Hi Smith, sorry, I wasn't ignoring. I just didn't want to like kill the moment. Thank you so much for coming in. I appreciate you. Hope you're doing okay. Jeeper, thank you so much for the lurk. E3 2019 trailer, it's epic. Is that on the Reddit? Bro, that was insane. I didn't expect her to do the flower thing. I just saw back that you finished the Elden Beast snatch victory. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lich. Yeah, at the very last minute. I know. Cause obviously, right? Like the thing, it looks like he was actually helping. Because the things that like everything that happened after the fight seemed like he was actually doing something good. Let's see, is that the max quality? Oh, perfect, perfect. Hope you're doing a case mess. That's for Dawn, America. What am I looking at? That's Godric. Godric.
You could even imagine it.
Is that Godric? That is Godric.
That which commanded the stars, giving life its fullest brilliance. The Elden Ring. Oh, Elden Ring. Shattered by someone or something.
So
Tell me you don't see it. Look up at the sky. It burns.
you know. So they don't know for sure that Marika did it. They just assume. This is just allegedly. But she was still in prison anyway, based on that assumption that she shattered it. Fucking hell. He is so good. Oh my god. All the feels. The reason why Radahn loses his mind is because of the zombie. Became a zombie is because of a and the grief of losing Godwin. But the starting of the video says, or maybe we know that from playing the game, but the trailer doesn't actually say that, right? Because it's saying somebody shattered the Elden Ring. Like they don't know who did it. It says on her armor, I see. It'll be fine. Okay. Right. Wow. Okay. Okay, the next video. Somebody mentioned another creator, but I can't remember what it was. Yo, like it doesn't even feel like a game. Like you don't understand. It feels more like a movie or like a real story. You know, I'm so immersed into it. Yeah. Huh? We learned later on the game that it's Rani. That it's Rani that shattered the ring. So and this person actually said there's a follow-up video, right?
Hi, my name is Inka, otherwise known as Noobtunes on the internet. I hope you enjoyed that video, but don't forget to subscribe and sign up for notifications for when next I post another video. And don't forget to follow the links in the description for all my socials. I hope to see you at my next go live on Twitch. Bye bye.